If you watched my video a couple of days ago, we talked about how in some leagues, having players that put up good shots, hits, or blocks is going to give you a massive advantage. Now, last video we focused on forwards, but now I want to talk about defensemen. I did mention in that video that according to the scoring system of the biggest fantasy hockey tournament in the world, Darnell Nurse averaged more fantasy points than Adam Faulk last year, and yet is going 8 rounds later than Faulk in drafts. You can gain some insane value by understanding this. If you're looking at ADP, guys, things don't really match reality. Quinn Hughes is going as a 14th defenseman off the board, and yet Seth Jones is going as a 28th despite averaging more fantasy points than him last season. If you're in a points league that values hit, shots, or blocks, then understanding this will help you win your fantasy hockey drafts. So listen clearly and draft some of these guys that I'm about to be talking about. The first player is Adam Larsson of the Seattle Kraken. He played great last year. He had a career season, putting up 33 points in 82 games, and he also puts up amazing peripherals: 143 shots, 222 hits, and 173 blocks. That is absolutely elite. His plus minus is good too. Now, I'm not sure if the Kraken can reproduce what they did last season, but he's in a favorable situation. And if we're looking at fantasy points per game, Adam Larsson averaged more fantasy points per game than Morgan Riley, Rasmus Anderson, Drew Doughty, Hampus Lindholm, Bowen Byram. The list goes on. Adam Larsson is valuable in those leagues that value shots, hits, and blocks. So take a look at him in your drafts. He is probably going to go pretty late. Next up is Mackenzie Weegar of the Calgary Flames. Now, he was disappointing, but he actually had a good second half of the year. He put up 31 points in 81 games, which is solid for a guy that doesn't put up a lot of power play time. 160 shots, 186 hits, 117 blocks. That is great. He had a very low shooting percentage too, so you could see that bounce back going into next season. He's not the same player that he was on Florida because he was just in such a great offense, but if the Calgary Flames can surprise some people and bounce back, then Mackenzie Weegar could be still very valuable in your fantasy hockey drafts. Take a look at him if your league values hit, shots, and blocks, and he is likely going to pay off. Seth Jones of the Chicago Blackhawks, a guy that I told you had more fantasy points per game than Quinn Hughes last season. He had 12 goals and a total of 37 points in 72 games, which is great. Now, if you're looking at shots, hits, and blocks, his shots are of the upper echelon of defensemen, and he puts up great hits and blocks. Chicago is still one of the worst teams in the league, but they added Connor Bedard. He is going to be on that first unit with Bedard, and if Bedard is as good as people are saying, then Seth Jones should produce on the power play. He should produce being their best offensive defenseman. So overall, if your league doesn't count plus minus, but value shots, hits, and blocks, he is definitely a steal in your fantasy hockey drafts, so take a look at Seth Jones. Next up is Justin Faulk of the St. Louis Blues, and this guy is criminally underrated. 50 points and also 11 goals in 82 games. That is incredible, and if you're looking at his peripherals, it gives him a huge edge against some of those other guys in that point range. 196 shots, 112 hits, and 140 blocks. That is great stuff. Drafting Justin Faulk is going to give you a massive edge in some of your drafts, guys. Look at the ADP in the biggest fantasy hockey tournament in the world. Justin Faulk had the same amount of fantasy points per game than Moritz Seider, and yet Seider is going as a 7th defenseman off the board, and Justin Faulk is going as a 30th. Again, if you're looking at fantasy points per game, Adam Faulk averaged 7.6 fantasy points per game, and Justin Faulk averaged 7.55. I'm not saying Faulk is going to have the same season putting up 50 points, but he could be a guy that puts up 40 points. He's an amazing offensive defenseman, and he has those peripherals too, so he has that safe floor baked in. Draft Justin Faulk if your league values those categories, and it is absolutely going to help you gain a massive advantage. Now, I quickly want to talk about Moritz Seider of the Detroit Red Wings. He is a little bit overvalued in drafts right now, guys, just because of the hype surrounding his name, but he is a guy that puts up so many shots, hits, and blocks. You aren't going to gain an edge in drafting him because he gets drafted so high, but I did want to mention him because if he does break out and puts up like 10 goals and 60 points, then he is a guy that is going to be a top 5 fantasy defenseman. Take a look at him in drafts. It might be a risky pick because there's not a lot of upside from his ADP right now, but I do think he is valuable and he has that safe floor baked in. Darnell Nurse is one of the most underrated players in fantasy hockey right now. If you are in a league that values one of shots, hits, or blocks, or a combo of them, you're not going to find many players that puts up that amount of those three together. He is so impressive, guys. 12 goals and a total of 43 points in 82 games. He gets no power play time, but it doesn't matter because he still plays so many minutes. His plus minus is good too, guys. A lot of people like to hate on Darnell Nurse. He was a plus 26. This guy's a solid defenseman, and I will be taking him in any of my drafts that value shots, hits, and blocks. And like I said at the beginning of this video, Darnell Nurse averaged more fantasy points per game than Adam Faulk, according to the league settings of the biggest fantasy hockey tournament in the world, and yet he's going like 8 rounds later, guys. So take a look at Darnell Nurse, and he is likely going to outperform his ADP. Like Seider, like Darnell Nurse, like Justin Faulk, Kris Letang is one of those rare players who not only can put up goals and assists, but also put up a rare combo of shots, hits, and blocks. 161 shots, 162 hits, 108 blocks. That is absolutely elite. And 41 points in 64 games is also amazing. Now, we do have to address the elephant in the room. Obviously, we have Erik Karlsson going to the Pens, and that is going to threaten Kris Letang's power play time. There is a possibility that they do run 3 forwards and 2 defensemen on the first unit, but I don't have the answer for you guys right now. According to those league settings, guys, Kris Letang last season was the 9th defenseman in fantasy points per game, ahead of Miro Heiskanen, ahead of Victor Hedman, ahead of Adam Fox. And despite being 9th in fantasy points per game amongst defensemen, Kris Letang is going as the 22nd defenseman off the board in these best puck drafts. I don't know if Erik Karlsson is going to lead to such a huge drop-off in fantasy points. Like I said, there is a chance that Kris Letang is on that first unit, and still he's going to rack up points in the Pittsburgh Penguins offense on the top pairing. So take a look at Kris Letang in your drafts. He has that safe floor, and the upside from his ADP is pretty big. The next guy is extremely underrated and might have the best trio of shots, hits, and blocks for a guy that can also put up points. It's Jakob Trouba of the New York Rangers. He had 8 goals and a total of 30 points in 82 games last year, and he had 199 shots, 218 hits, and 196 blocks. That is absolutely elite. According to the league settings that I talked about, this may surprise you guys. Last season, Jakob Trouba averaged more fantasy points per game than Victor Hedman and Adam Fox, and yet is going way later in drafts. Jakob Trouba is going as the 23rd defenseman off the board, compared to Adam Fox, who is going as the 6th defenseman, and compared to Victor Hedman, who's going as the 9th defenseman. There's just so much upside from his ADP in these best puck drafts, and this could be the case in your redraft leagues as well. Take a look at your league settings, and if it values shots, hits, and blocks, you need to draft Jakob Trouba. I would be stupid if I didn't talk about Jakob Chychrun of the Ottawa Senators. This guy's been one of the most underrated defensemen in fantasy hockey in the last couple of seasons. Not only can he score goals and put up points, but he also puts up a monster amount of shots, hits, and blocks. Maybe not so much hits, but shots and blocks. He is elite. Unfortunately, he hasn't been able to stay healthy. He is a band-aid, but he's still a guy that's in the prime of his career. He's 25 years old. He's playing on this rising Senators offense. I don't think he is going to be on that first unit, but he will see power play time on one of the best power plays in the league, and I do think he will be valuable, guys, playing alongside some amazing talent. Now, obviously, Chychrun missed a lot of time last year. He only played 48 games, but according to those settings, Chychrun was the 11th best defenseman in fantasy points per game last season, and yet right now he's going as the 25th defenseman in this fantasy hockey tournament, guys. That is pretty crazy to me. I do think he has upside from his ADP. So take a look at Chychrun, guys. If he can stay healthy, he will provide a lot of value. Mikhail Sergachev of the Tampa Bay Lightning is a guy that I'm really high on going into the season. He's a guy that's in the prime of his career at 25 years old, and he played fantastic last year. 10 goals and a total of 64 points in 79 games is elite. He took over the first line power play, bumped Hedman to the second unit, and yes, in some games they did go back and forth, but Hedman is only getting older and Sergachev is entering his prime, so I expect Sergachev to be on that first unit. I do think last year was the beginning of Tampa Bay's downfall because those guys are getting older, but they still have an elite offense. They still have an elite power play as well, so he's one of those rare players that can put up those 3 categories and eclipse 60 points in any given season, so draft Sergachev. He definitely has some upside from his ADP, and he has that safe floor baked in with those great peripherals. Rasmus Dahlin of the Buffalo Sabres completely broke out last year, putting up 15 goals and a total of 73 points in 78 games. But along with these great points on this rising Buffalo Sabres offense, he puts up a great amount of shots, hits, and blocks. 204 shots, 105 hits, 132 blocks, and that is going to give you an edge in your fantasy hockey leagues, guys. Now, you could say, oh, the Buffalo Sabres are going to regress. Whatever, I don't know what is going to happen with them, but Rasmus Dahlin is a mainstay on that first unit, on that first pairing, and he is 23 years old. There's a chance he could take another step forward in his game, playing alongside some really talented offensive players, so I will definitely be drafting Rasmus Dahlin in these drafts. He had the 4th best fantasy points per game last year. He's extremely talented, and I look forward to seeing how he performs this season. The number 1 player on this list is Roman Josi of the Nashville Predators. This guy is one of my favorite fantasy hockey defensemen. I had him in my home league with all of my high school friends 2 years ago, and that's the year he put up 96 points in 80 games. Obviously, that was an outlier at 31 years old, but still, he is an elite defenseman. Last year, he had 18 goals and a total of 59 points in 67 games. There's no doubt that he's one of the best fantasy hockey defensemen. He's not too old yet, so I'm not expecting a big decline. I know there's some questions about how good Nashville is going to be this season, but I still think they are going to compete. They have a lot of young, talented players as well. Now, the reason you want to draft Roman Josi is shots, guys. He puts up a decent amount of hits. It's not great for a defenseman. His blocks are elite as well, but the main thing is shots. 269 shots in 67 games was second amongst defensemen in the NHL. He was only 6 shots behind Dougie Hamilton, so if he played a full season, Josi would have led NHL defensemen in shots by a wide margin, and that is just so elite, guys. He is one of those players that is going to put up points on the power play too. If you're looking at fantasy points per game last year, according to these settings, he almost had a point more than Cale Makar in fantasy points per game. His shot total is just unmatched, guys. Extremely good value with Roman Josi in leagues that value shots, blocks, and hits. That's the end of the video, guys. Make sure you hit that like button, make sure you hit that subscribe button, and I will catch you in the next one. Take care.